let me just start by welcoming all of you to the Assessing Multi-Level Action for Biodiversity and Climate workshop. My name is Sander Chan. I'm a senior researcher at the Global Center on Adaptation. And together with Andrew Denault, who will serve as rapporteur in this workshop, and Idil Boran, we have been working on assessing the role and impact of transnational climate actions and nature-based solutions. So the topic of this session is really of interest to us as well, and we look forward to the discussion. Andrew Denault is my colleague at the German Development Institute, and he will be taking notes today and report back to the stocktake session. Andrew, are you here? Okay, good.
Yes, here.
Thank you. So please note that Andrew will be taking notes live, and we will share the note-taking template in the chat with you now, so you can also have access and add comments, questions, and additional insights, and possibly resources. This workshop will be recorded for reference and archival purposes only. Please type your questions for panelists in the workshop chat. We will reserve some time at the end for your questions, but do note that at the top of the chat box, you will see different options for the workshop or event, and we will only be monitoring the questions that are coming in through the workshop chat. We have 2 tech supporters in the room today. If you encounter any technical issue, type your issue in the workshop and they will help you as best as they can. And to the panelists, if you are planning to share your screen, you can click the TV icon next to the microphone. For participants, it's best to put the session on full screen mode when someone is sharing their screen. You get there by clicking on the 3 little dots in the top right to start the full screen modus. So I'm very pleased to introduce our excellent panelists. First, we have Dr. Natalie Petorelli, senior scientist at the Zoological Society of London. She works in biodiversity monitoring and conservation with a strong interest in climate change ecology and nature-based solutions. Natalie conducts high-quality, innovative, and internationally recognized research, taking a multidisciplinary approach involving ecology, statistics, remote sensing, and programming. And Natalie has edited and co-authored 5 books and over 150 publications. We also have with us Ineke Naandrup. Ineke works with the international project management of Oro Verde Tropical Forest Foundation, which is based in Germany. Ineke holds a master's degree in forest sciences and forest ecology from the University of Göttingen. Ineke is an expert in mechanisms for upscaling ecosystem-based adaptation measures in Oro Verde's Green Watersheds project, which is implemented across 4 countries in Central America. We are also joined by Jeffrey Chi. Jeffrey is a policy analyst with the Resilience Program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. He's based in Vancouver and he provides research, project management, and communication support with a focus on national adaptation planning, ecosystem-based adaptation, and the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'm also delighted to welcome our colleague, Dr. Katarzyna Negacz, or Kate. who is postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Environmental Studies, IVM, at VU University Amsterdam. Kate works on the governance of biodiversity and food systems. Her research focuses on non-state and subnational actors in the global biodiversity governance and the potential of saline degraded lands for sustainable food production. And we might still be joined by a fifth panelist, Alexandra de Pres, who also joined our opening plenary yesterday. Alexandra is a research fellow at IDRI, where she works on international climate governance and cooperation, particularly on how to better align climate and biodiversity policy and action at the UNFCCC COP23 and COP24. Alexandra worked as a negotiator on the Paris Agreement rulebook as part of Costa Rica's UN climate negotiations team. And previously, she worked at IDRI in support of the French presidency of COP21, the Paris Agreement, of course, developing proposals for transparency frameworks of the agreement. Alexandra has also worked at the Environmental Defense Fund on corporate sustainability and sustainable supply chains in the Amazon, and she studied environmental policy, international relations, and anthropology and environmental studies. All in all, a very exciting panel. And I would like to start with Natalie. Natalie, based on your experience as a scientist at the Zoological Society of London, can you share some insights from your work on multi-level action for nature and the gaps that you might have identified and imbalances in assessing those actions?
Sure. Thanks, Sander, for this introduction. So just to give you a context, I'm an ecologist working at the Zoological Society of London, which is a global science-led conservation charity which was founded over 200 years ago. And what we do is that we work with local communities and governments and other NGOs in over 50 countries to bend the curve on marine, terrestrial, and freshwater biodiversity loss. So myself, I'm a scientist, which therefore based in the science division of the society, which itself is an independent government-funded higher education institution. Now, nature protection and restoration is really at the heart of what we do. The society is involved in the science and the practice of protected areas management, ecosystem restoration, and more recently, rewilding. Of interest to this discussion, we host the IUCN Specialist Group on Mangrove, given their importance in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is something that is quite present in our discussion when we talk about mangroves, as well as the newly formed IUCN Intercommissional Rewilding Group. So that's an IUCN initiative to try to develop some guidelines and policy around rewilding on consensus. So we just published a recent position paper on the importance of tackling biodiversity and climate change crisis in unison. So I'm guessing I'll draw from that position paper that I led, as well as some of my insight for answering your question. So I think the first thing that I would say is that there's no one there's no one shoe that fits all. The context is extremely dependent, and depending where you work, something that may work somewhere may not work somewhere else, and that's to me, as illustrated over the years, the importance of considering the social ecological system that you're engaging with, as opposed to just focusing on ecological system, which is a natural tendency for an ecologist. I primarily work in ecosystem restoration and rewilding in Asia and Europe. And so based on what I've seen, I would say that the projects that are delivering the best are the ones that tend to have benefits that clearly benefit the local community in a fairly distributed way, that has local support and engagement from the onset, where communication is really transparent and all the partners feel really valued, and where local ownership is clear. And so a good example is this of those kind of projects that we have been running for a while is a mangrove restoration project in the Philippines that has really grows from strength to strength because of these different assets. So not just because mangrove are important to the world, but mangrove was actually really important to the people living where those projects took place. Another thing that I think is important as a scientist to realize, and one of the lessons definitely I learned, is that science is not the only stakeholder, and it only informs decision. It doesn't dictate it. It's not because something makes sense to a scientist that's the right thing to do. And scientists tend to approach a lot of those projects with an overall idea that their opinion will prevail because it's science. And that sometimes is quite detrimental to progress. Another thing that I think is important is that a lot of there is a real difficulty in articulating expectation and global vision into propositions that have enough details, such as timescale, measure of biodiversity benefits, scaling of solution, as well as lacking some clear communication around risk, and that can really also affect the outcome of a project, because details matters to people, and because communication matter, and also because being clear about what are the risks and what are the possible trajectory really help build trust, and trust is paramount to get an environmental project such as a restoration project or a rewilding project or a protected area really working. Other stuff that I would is that for the moment, when you're thinking about the nexus between climate change mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity conservation, you're really looking at two types of main action, or there's two types of action that are really focused a lot within multiple communities, and that's protection and restoration. But it's really important to understand that their importance vary, especially as of there are areas where restoration is important, but there are other areas where it's to improve protection of what already exists. And the associated challenges with those approaches, including the scientific one, are a very different nature. Now, there's a lot of things that we know and we have learned through decades of protected area management or decades of restoration. But we don't always use that knowledge, and we sometimes easily cut corners. And the problem is that that still has a massive impact on the outcome of those projects. There's also a lot of things we actually don't know, and we should be able to be open about this and have those discussions, which would help co-design and co-create and advance some project instead of ultimately reducing trust. I think then there's also a tension between mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and by that I mean that right now there's a huge focus, especially as we come up to COP26, on mitigation. And that's for multiple reasons, but mainly I would say because also mitigation is relatively easy to track and understand. Adaptation is quite difficult to track progress, and biodiversity is an extremely complex concept with multiple dimensions that do not systematically co-vary positively. Now, this focus on mitigation, I think, is opening the door for an increased risk of greenwashing. And we see it in various countries where the focus has been put on tree and not on nature per se. So as we approach COP26 and we're going through this idea of trying to push a biodiversity and agenda in a climate forum, it's really going to be important to speak as one voice on key principles. If we want nature-based solution to deliver, particularly on biodiversity, so not trying to compromise one of the other, and be aware of the complexity and the uncertainty that goes with those concepts. And then finally, I'll try to say that the current focus on mitigation and on trees as also to some extent reduced discussion around other ecosystems that have also incredible potential for climate mitigation. So, for example, peatlands, seagrass, salt marshes, wetlands, and adaptation. coral reef or tidal marshes. So if I was to say what kind of lesson did I learn very quickly and very shortly, I would say that first, people matter. The way we do things matter, trust matters. And for the moment, there's not enough attention paid to the social context, the social aspect of social ecological system, and the importance of co-design engagement with local community. There's really a need for more connection with the local context, but also a connection between different sciences. So these are complex problems that cannot just be approached by some type of scientists, such as biologists. It also needs social science. It also needs economic, by different stakeholders. It can't be just academics or NGOs. It also has to involve civil servants and others. And currently, that fragmentation of expertise and that lack of communication and collaboration is, to me, I think, harming progress. The other step is to be really important on building consensus around clear goals. What do we want to do for each project, not overall? And then really communicate that across the chain of actor if you want a project to succeed. And in that respect, designing a monitoring framework and some adaptive management that is really tailored around those agreed goals increase the likelihood that the project will go well. Likewise, acknowledging and managing risk from the onset and in a transparent way is important for project success. And finally, I would say that thing that we need to think about is how we coordinate at scale. So for the moment, many of the efforts that we're doing are not working at the scale at which the threats are happening. And too often we really forget to think about how different projects or initiatives connect and how we can scale up. And if we were to get better at this, we would probably have more impact. And that's it. Thank you.
Very much, Natalie, for pointing out that no one shoe fits all. But I also feel like a tension there almost, because I mean, this session is also about assessing and measuring progress to some extent. But I come from the climate world where a lot of this has been around mitigation, and there you do have kind of this need to aggregate at the highest level. So I think it's important to understand like how, for instance, nature-based solutions work in here, and whether we can adopt the same mindset in terms of measuring progress.
I don't see a tension in valuing everyone's contribution. It's to scale up things, you need people to be on board, and telling them that it's going to be like that because it has to be like that everywhere is a very bad way to engage people. So yeah. I think we sometimes just need to spend the time, even if it's not something we like to, because it looks more efficient if we had just one delivery thing that we force upon. But if it doesn't work, you're losing time and money. So I agree that we need to develop a common mindset, but we need to do that not by saying that it already exists, but slowly building up bricks by bricks.
And that is why we also have this workshop, of course. So next, I would like to invite Jeffrey to the floor. Jeffrey, based on your work as a policy analyst at IISD, could you share some of the top priorities for strengthening integrated biodiversity and climate action, especially in national adaptation strategies?
For sure. Thank you, Sander. First, thank you to CIFA and York University for putting together the session and invite IISD to share our work on the National Adaptation Plan, or NAP, and its connection to biodiversity. I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded indigenous territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We pay profound respect to the host of this land for their stewardship since time immemorial. Undoubtedly, climate change impacts and biodiversity loss must be addressed urgently and ambitiously across all levels of governance, and neither problem will be successfully resolved unless both are tackled together. For some of you who might not be familiar with the National Adaptation Plan, or NAPS, it's a strategic process under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that enable countries to identify and address their medium and long-term climate adaptation priorities. It is now a part of the Paris Agreement, and it really involves analyzing the current and future climate impacts. it also helps countries identify vulnerabilities and gaps in adaptation. So a country's NAP provides a basis for identifying the different options for adaptation and planning for their eventual implementation at all levels of governance. So on biodiversity and climate change, a thriving biodiversity inherently underpins any climate adaptation efforts. Healthy ecosystem is vital for communities that rely on natural resources and the ecosystem services that supports livelihood and reduce vulnerabilities for the most vulnerable groups. At the same time, biodiversity decline and ecosystem degradation threaten existing adaptation efforts, limit our future options for adaptation, and intensify the occurrence and the magnitude of natural disasters around the world, all of which are putting more people at risk and putting more vulnerable groups at risk as well. So therefore, recognizing and linking the biodiversity climate nexus is a central part of the NAP process. For us, here are the three priorities that we identify as kind of key priorities for strengthening this linkage through our research and our work across developing countries. So first, ecosystem resilience and vulnerability assessments are clear mandates of the National Adaptation Plan process. It calls for incorporating detailed information about ecosystem vulnerabilities for climate change that will inform better adaptation planning and implementation at all levels of governance. But most importantly, a localized vulnerability assessment is especially important. As Natalie has mentioned, adaptation and biodiversity efforts depend fundamentally on local actions and local realities and contexts. So this process highlights how how communities and people's well-being inherently rely on healthy ecosystems and emphasize the role of nature in reducing community vulnerabilities to climate change, as well as how adaptation efforts could support biodiversity and conservation objectives, supplementing national biodiversity action with local implementation. Second here is using ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA, as a central adaptation response will meet the objectives of multiple international agreements at once. So last year, as part of our work as a secretariat for the NAP Global Network, we undertook a review of the NAP documents submitted by developing countries to better understand the extent to which countries are incorporating ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solution for adaptation as a response measure to climate change impacts, as well as for biodiversity loss. And the overall results is very clear that we found that developing countries have already recognized the vital role nature-based solution can play, in particular to help people and ecosystems adapt to climate change. So for example, in Fiji, EBA forms a prominent part of its national adaptation plan. These nature-based solutions are a very good way for Fiji to meet its obligations under both the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as supporting the country to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. NBS strategies for adaptation, such as watershed and forest restoration and protection, as well as planting vetiver grass along riverbanks and inland slopes, really help Fiji protect its vibrant and rich biodiversity, while helping communities, especially coastal communities, adapt to climate impacts and mitigate disaster risks. Of course, there are a lot of ongoing debates about the use of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. Both in terms of criticism for lack of biodiversity focus in nature-based climate solutions, or like just mentioned, greenwashing, especially nature-based solution for mitigation. And also for the perpetuation of a worldview that separates human and nature and results in land grab and rights violation for the most vulnerable groups, including indigenous peoples. So therefore, strong safeguards, in our view, not only for ecosystem protection, but also for indigenous rights, gender equity, and social inclusion are essential when implementing NBS projects for climate adaptation. Local community consultations, participation, and ownership are key to good multi-level cooperation on biodiversity protection and climate adaptation. And lastly here, so linking the National Adaptation Plan and the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan, or NBSAP, helps countries better coordinate and explore the synergies between adaptation and biodiversity protection. So NBSAP is a crucial part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It allows countries to formulate and outline their strategies of protecting biodiversity and ecosystems. So a country's NBSAP provides a snapshot of the risks and vulnerabilities faced by its ecosystems, and it also allows countries to present its plans to master those challenges. Therefore, both the NBSAP and that process call for a holistic approach in terms of adaptation and ecosystem protection planning. So consolidating work streams and activities under both plans, such as protecting mangrove forests or restoring different ecosystems, could really strengthen the synergies between biodiversity protection and adaptation planning. And exploring synergy also avoids duplication of work and a waste of valuable human and financial resources for respective governments and implementation entities at the subnational level. So to conclude, given that almost 125 countries are currently undertaking the NAP process, they really showcase how integrating biodiversity protection into adaptation planning can create co-benefits and a key avenue to bridge biodiversity protection and climate adaptation, as well as scaling up the use of nature-based solutions for not just climate change, but also biodiversity protection as well, with proper safeguards included to solve societal challenges and build resilience around the world. I'm probably very over time, so I will just end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for pointing out the importance to link climate and biodiversity action into national adaptation plans. Next, we have Ineke Nandrup. Can you share an example of a successful project, ecosystem-based adaptation in Central America, because you've been working with Oro Verde, of course, across 4 countries. What are the lessons learned from this initiative? You are on mute, Ineke. Do you see the? Do you have a microphone? Okay. Maybe you can log out and log in again. Maybe that helps. If you don't mind, then I will first move to Alexandra. All right, Alexandra, then we will move on to you if that is okay. So, of course, we heard you yesterday in the opening session, but maybe you can talk with us a little bit more about the key trade-offs in aligning climate and biodiversity ambitions and what opportunities you might see.
Yes, thank you so much, Sander, and thank you to everyone for a very interesting session. So I guess we've heard about nature-based solutions, and indeed there are many synergies between climate and biodiversity action, but of course there are also trade-offs. And in the work that I've been doing, even in terms of like crossing, I mean, I guess the IPCC and IPBES report this summer really showed that, for instance, a key climate mitigation or carbon dioxide removal solution, so for the climate side, which is very problematic for biodiversity, is the question of bioenergy, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which doesn't exist yet fully, but is used massively in climate plans into the future. So I feel like in everything I've read, it really seems that this question of very large use of bioenergy and BECCS in the pathways that the IPCC has assessed so far to reach the 1.5 degree goal for climate is very problematic, because basically research earlier this year showed that 97% of pathways to reach the 1.5 or 2 degrees goal use bioenergy at a scale that would actually require transforming, I guess, using more land, and therefore this would very likely be infringe upon biodiversity hotspots or agricultural lands in the tropics. And of course, we're at a time where we need to decrease the pressures on natural lands. And so the overuse of these techniques in long-term plans for climate or long-term pathways is problematic, given that these are the pathways also that I guess shape like the imaginary of the sort of solution space we have into the future, and directly also influences countries and non-state actors in terms of what kind of ambition they will have in their plans. And so basically thinking more concretely about, for instance, COP26 and the future of, I guess, international climate policy and how these issues can be better connected there, I would say that two areas I think are really important are, on the one hand, having better, more integrated science, and I guess, as was discussed earlier, and in particular, I guess, the development of sustainability pathways that really aim to reach both the climate and biodiversity objectives. And so for that, of course, the work of the IPBES and IPCC so far this summer is a good start, but I would really feel that there needs to be additional research, and yes, even a joint, official joint report by them would be excellent. So that would be one thing. And then the second thing is this question of the long-term strategies that countries have been invited under the Paris Agreement to submit. There are like 30 or so far that have done so. And there's a push at COP26 to continue inviting countries to do so. And these plans so far have not included mapping out what would be the impact of projected climate policy in the future onto biodiversity. And I think it would be a really excellent tool for countries to start doing that mapping out and pretty much identify also what would be sort of problems if they recur to way too much bioenergy or other measures. And yes, so I guess I would say that those are two key issues, and I'll leave it at there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Yeah, I mean, what you describe almost is like, some governments might kind of, use bioenergy and CCS almost as a deus ex machina, right? To have a solution. And we really need to kind of map out, what is actually the impact there. And I think this is definitely one priority we need to note down in this workshop. So I will try to connect with Ineke again. Ineke, can you mute yourself? I see that works. So Ineke, maybe you can share your example and your experience with Oro Verde.
Yes, thank you very much, Sander. And I'm sorry for this technical issue. I don't know why I couldn't unmute myself. And now I'd like to share some slides that I prepared in advance, because I did try to also touch some of other points mentioned before the meeting or before the session, and I wanted to kind of try to link them over together.
We see your screen, yes.
You can see it in the presentation mode?
We see it, yeah, correctly.
Perfect, thank you very much. So yeah, I'd like to give you today some little insights from our project Green Watersheds, where I'm working in at Oro Verde, specifically on the topic of commitment integrity on multi-level action as kind of title of our session, and how we see there are some parallels in our project and some lessons learned that we identified with our partners. But first, I'd like to give you at least like a very, very brief introduction to our project. As you can see, like ecosystem-based adaptation is providing the main or the basic approach in this project to identify and implement together with local communities measures to help adapt to climate change related risks. Our project area is located in 4 different watersheds in Latin America or in Central America. So it's Guatemala, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. And as already with this basic approach, our partners and us, we actually perceive in our project that ecosystem-based adaptation is providing a good base to both face climate, but also biodiversity-related objectives in the project. So also not only help people adapting to climate change in those local communities, but also actually contributing to healthy ecosystems and local biodiversity. Another additional important component of our project is participatory governance, and this is a bit the link we see to today's session with how we understand multi-level action, how that can work, linking climate and biodiversity protection. And also this is a main opportunity in our project or component in our project to upscale local solutions that are implemented. In our case, it's in each watershed we are implementing and developing one governance mechanism. So 4 in total, 2 of those more on community level, 2 on regional level. And as kind of a first step to do so, we assess each area. So in this case, each watershed area to understand a bit the broader context we are working in, or our partners are working in there, which often in our case, this context usually consists of a conflict of interests that is identified, usually a conflict of interests about the usage of resources, in the case of our project, the resource of water. And this analysis of the current state also includes the analysis of key stakeholders there, so their power relations, dynamics, interdependencies, asymmetries between stakeholders, but also specifically their interest in the resource of water in this area. The stakeholders are then afterwards selected for the participation in the mechanism, not only due to their relevance in the area, but also obviously also to their interest to participate in that. In our case, I'd say that also the stakeholders, or most of the stakeholders participating, are actually also the ones benefiting from this governance mechanism, as we work or focus on governance on natural resources. As kind of a second step, then a future vision is created together with those stakeholders involved, which we also perceive as a key aspect to actually achieve commitment of those stakeholders as you are kind of creating a common goal together. Here, our partner organizations worked with the concept of the theory of change to identify long-term impacts to contribute or work towards to. And this creation of a vision, we also see key to, at the beginning, initiate the participation of those stakeholders involved. So both the initial participation, but also the longer term commitment. And here it proved to be useful in the project or in our project experience with our partners to use in this creation of a future vision to use scientific data, but also apart from this vision or this common goal to also start visualizing or explaining a bit the failure to act. So what would happen then specifically, what would it cause for the work or business context that the stakeholders are working in, the stakeholders involved in this mechanism. The governance mechanisms implemented within our projects can then be kind of seen a little bit as a mechanism to work towards this future vision. In the context of our projects, these mechanisms can provide different functions, for example, financing certain measures in the watershed, or the facilitation of multi-stakeholder processes, of commitment, of also capacity building or communication issues. And as you can see, it's again like we work with governance of natural resources. So the objective usually concerns the usage or sustainable management of natural resources, but still a lot of the stakeholders involved, they rather aim for resulting benefits of that. So they much rather go for example, the improvement of livelihoods or increased or more stable incomes. So they are much more aiming for the resulting benefits and not for the protection of natural resources in the first place. As also case studies were mentioned a bit before this session as like a key component to maybe for the assessment of commitment. We see that that can be quite helpful in the establishment and functioning of governance mechanisms. In our case, we're going to conduct a case study in each of our watershed areas. So the objective of that is to obtain data to convince stakeholders to support or also finance certain measures. To do so, first, the target stakeholders will be identified and then not only chosen due to their relevance again in the area, but also much more due to the fact if they are actually already affected by climate change related risks, that the measures implemented in the project, the EBA measures, are achieving or trying to reduce. So we really try to draw this connection between risks that are already affecting the stakeholders involved and the measures that we try to push within our project. Then a cost-benefit analysis will be conducted for those EBA measures identified, and those results then communicated to the stakeholders to try to achieve further support from their side and also much more like further or long-term commitment to that. So that's already my end. I hope I could share at least some insights or some aspects of our project. On the COP, we will not only, or we would like to not only present these insights or lessons learned how to upscale it by governance, but also much more on finance, on political, as these are kind of our different aspects we are working on in our project.
Thank you, Ineke, and certainly you did. And I think what really came to the fore in your example is also the role of assessment in and scientific data, not only for itself, but to communicate clearly what is at stake and to involve stakeholders in kind of early participation in these projects. Thank you very much. Kate, great to see you here. Based on your research, who would you say are participating in multi-level action, and what kind of collaborative initiatives do you see that need more strengthening maybe? And do you think that research methodologies here can help strengthen participation of underrepresented actors?
Thank you very much, Sander. I'm really happy to be present here and be able to discuss this with you. That's a very good question. Starting with a little bit of the background, we work here together at IVM, so at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, with a team of researchers, and we also collaborate with people the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency on the project that is mostly focusing on biodiversity governance. And here we mostly look at global biodiversity initiatives. By the collaborative international initiatives, we mean projects, programs, institutions, or initiatives that work across the borders, but that also focus on this governance goal of biodiversity, have a governance function, and collaborate with different stakeholders. This brings us to also an overarching question of how can all sectors of the society, including public, non-state, and sub-national actors, contribute to implementation of CBD goals, so biodiversity goals, but also climate goals. And that actually breaks down to a few other questions. So first, looking at this institutional landscape of different stakeholders involved in the biodiversity governance. So different actors collaborating for the initiatives, where they are, how do they look like, how do they cooperate. Then we also look at different criteria that can be used to assess their work. So again, linking to the previous presentation, assessment is very important. How we can actually assess their input, their output, outcome and impact. Then further, we look also at what data is available to assess these initiatives, because this is also not always obvious that all the data is publicly available. And finally, we also look at how these initiatives can be brought closer to CBD, but also to UNFCCC, so that they can have the synergistic effect and help to address both biodiversity and climate goals. And in order to answer your question, I would say that there are a few different lines of research and also ways of analyzing input and output of international collaborative initiatives. The way we do it is looking at the broad landscape of them. So we collected a database right now around 400 initiatives that work on biodiversity. Oscar has already, in his speech yesterday, talked a little bit how it looks like, but it gives us a good overview of who is there. And we can say that still most of the initiatives for biodiversity are public, but there's also a very clear trend of them moving towards the more hybrid and inclusive type of governance. So we see more and more initiatives partnering with either private or social actors, being more inclusive, more collaborative in that way. Then we also see that their main function is information sharing and networking. And that's super important because they can serve as a bridge between different areas of governance, but also raise awareness and, well, help us to address those goals. When we look at their geographical scope, they're mostly located, well, their secretariats are mostly located in Europe, but their actions are quite often global and focusing on the places where biodiversity hotspots are located. So here we see that there is definitely this good fit as well. Then the second thing that I would like to mention, the second direction to explore is accountability. We believe that it's really important to see whether these initiatives working for both biodiversity and climate are accountable and whether they monitor, report, and verify what they actually do. We found out that so far, most of them monitor, their progress towards the goals. Quite a few, above 60%, they also report on that, but the verification is still something that needs to be addressed. Further, we also look at effectiveness, and here we focus on how these initiatives can succeed. So what are the enabling factors? And we see that they can be, for example, effective leadership, but also good goal setting. So there's a number of different goals, there's a number of different criteria that can contribute to the success of these initiatives. Finally, another link to the presentation that was just given by Ineke, theories of change. We also believe that this is very important, and this is also something that appears in the initiatives. We have identified 4 different theories of change adapted by the initiatives, so the ways in which they try to address biodiversity goals, also in relation to climate. And finally, case studies. We also look at the initiatives, by dividing them, for example, into initiatives that work on protected areas. So how can they help to address the challenges of the protected areas? We also look at the initiatives that focus on financing. So what are the sources of financing for biodiversity? That's another good question that appears because we see that quite often funds and capacity is missing in order to address goals. And finally, we also start to explore the landscape approach. So we see also how different initiatives can take this holistic approach, taking into account not only nature, but also people in the landscape. So these are the key messages that I wanted to pass. So thank you very much, and over to you, Sander.
Thank you very much, Kate, to share with us your exciting research on this. So now we move into the Q&A part, and we do have about 10 minutes for that, which is not much. But therefore, I would like to ask one question maybe to multiple people here, maybe to Natalie, but also to Kate, because Kate, you you mentioned, this trend of more engagement around the CBD, around the UNFCCC, a trend towards more hybrid and inclusive, you say. At the same time, you say, but most secretariats and most, leaders are in Europe, and although they implement in developing countries. So, I do wonder, does this mean, is it really inclusive? It might be hybrid, but is it really inclusive? More doesn't mean inclusive necessarily, I think. And that does connect a little bit, I think, with what Natalie you brought to the fore, that especially from the climate side and nature-based solutions, the emphasis on mitigation and the kind of drumming up of the mobilization around mitigation does open the door for greenwashing, maybe to some extent. So I would like to hear your reflections maybe on this strong trend that we see of engagement around engagement processes around the UNFCCC and now also the CBD, whether it is really more inclusive, and what does it take to make sure that they are inclusive?
Okay, thank you, Sander. That's an excellent point, and I very much agree that there's a clear disparity that between the place where the secretariats are located and the places where actions are actually implemented. And as you said, of course, there's a difference between being inclusive in the sense of taking into account all different, well, I would say actors present in the society, so social, private, and public actors, and in terms of involving people who are actually affected by these actions, who live in the places where biodiversity hotspots are located, and who are, well, strictly stakeholders of these possible actions and and the implementation of different programs. And I must say that here, looking into a specific case that we have just analyzed with my colleague Matilda into the protected areas, we found out that these initiatives that operate there, that focus on protected areas, even though they mostly include public and civil society actors, these are civil society organizations that international general level, but we cannot say at the moment that whether they include indigenous peoples, whether they include local communities, so people who are at the very much center of the discussion there and who are directly affected and involved in the management of the protected areas. So I think that's a very important question.
So I think that there's a lot of things to unpack in that question, at least I would say. The first thing is that the convention are there to give some kind of vision into the world in where we want to live in. And what we're saying is that for the moment we have created convention per problem, and we're slowly discovering that all those problems are interacting. So it starts to make sense to actually bring things together, because this is about joining the dots, and we have just seen that it doesn't work when we don't connect. So there is a movement to try to bring all those conventions and those discussions together at the international scale and then at the national scale. But then there's a whole operation system of translating a vision into action, local action. And so the inclusivity is at different level. Of course, it's not inclusive. I mean, the thing is that we are just opening in some country into real discussion about what inclusivity mean. This is really the first IUCN Congress I've seen where there's a real discussion around indigenous people and their representation. This has just not happened before, but those people were there before. So it's opening up. We are on a pathway, and it's not perfect. I would say that it looked to me that we're going into the right direction. The question is whether we are going fast enough. I think that the inclusivity problem matters at all level, but we need to engage actors at different level to detail and communicate and think about how to increase that at that level. So inclusivity at the international level is very different in terms of tackling than inclusivity, for example, locally. because this is just completely different problem. So I don't know whether it answers your stuff, but I think there's a multitude of things to unpack and then to fix and think at different scale. It's not an easy question.
I do realize that, Natalie, and I don't expect that we have a full answer by the end of the session, but I think it is a very important thing to unpack at all levels. That does bring me to the NAPs that Jeffrey discusses, because, well, you mentioned, Natalie, the need to, not only moving in the right direction, but also moving in the direction with some speed, right? Because there's some urgency behind it. Jeffrey, am I right that at the moment there's just very few NAPs, right? And will it pick up speed? And do you see from the current NAPs that there is kind of this integration, that there is safeguards for social inclusion?
For sure. Thank you for the question. So first, the NAPs, the NAPs are a slow-moving process. From the most recent subsidiary bodies negotiation, we heard from developing countries that COVID-19 has significantly delayed the planning and the implementation of a number of countries' NAPs. And at this moment, developing countries require more financial resources, more technical resources, and in general, just more support in terms of both developing a NAP as well as implementing some of the actions that are identified at the NAP. So that's closely linked to a number of ongoing negotiations in terms of climate finance and the adaptation fund that would be able to finance all of the adaptation efforts, as well as linking those adaptation efforts with their biodiversity operations at home. So in the second part, what we are seeing is countries are integrating gender-based analysis. Countries are integrating indigenous traditional ecological knowledge systems into their national adaptation planning. However, there is a difference, like Natalie said, inclusivity on the national level versus inclusivity when we are actually implementing a project at the local level. So how do we translate these plans into action is still a very much open question. For us, what is needed is indigenous knowledge systems must be a central part of the national adaptation process or any EBA project implementation. To avoid that criticism of greenwashing and to truly be inclusive of different vulnerable groups and people of all genders in the adaptation process. In addition, we've also seen a number of countries taking an interesting approach in terms of prioritizing youth inputs and prioritizing gender-based analysis in their national adaptation planning process to really recognize the differential impacts on young people and on people of all genders by climate change impacts. So it is a trend, and it's going forward at a much faster pace than before, and it's going in the right direction. But there are still a lot of work left to do to actually implement those plans at the local level.
That is good to hear. Now, we don't have much time left for discussion, unfortunately. However, I will ask one question for Alexandra and Ineke both, and I'm very sorry, but could you try to address that very briefly? And that is, you both talked about the role of science, research, case studies, and how that can help better policies and better projects. Can you tell me exactly how integrated science could help, for instance, long-term strategies, and in Ineke's case, Oro Verde and its projects in South America?
Sure. Thanks, Sander, for the question. I mean, for me, it just seems essential to have more integrated science between the climate and biodiversity communities for basically to map out like pathways that reach the climate goal while taking into account the biodiversity and ecosystem integrity we need. And we see that that's not the case when given the sort of massive recourse to carbon dioxide removal and, for instance, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. And so the way that more integrated, I mean, by mapping out what are the actual sort of pathways to the climate goals that integrates biodiversity, it basically reduces the amount of sinks and like that we can depend on. And so that basically would inform, I mean, would be critical to inform current levels of mitigation action, because it basically means that we need to mitigate even more. If we want to get to net zero without using a lot of the net, we need a lot of zeros. So to me, that's, and also I feel like for all the people who have been advocating for like net zero integrity or real zero, I feel like it's been a lot on a sort of like a moral level that we need to act now. But in fact, integrating this biodiversity thing issue basically gives a more like grounded scientific reason for why it's just not even feasible to bank on like, yeah, these massive sinks in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Alexandra.
Yes, just super briefly. Yeah, I think we see as the biggest challenge actually the gap in finance, that kind of, yeah, that there is to actually finance adaptation, especially of local communities to climate change related risks. So, and there we also see the biggest opportunities for case studies to, for example, like I mentioned in our project, to actually conduct cost benefit analysis that really do not only assess a bit the risks that certain sectors, like also parts of the private sector, are already facing because of climate change, but also the impact of measures that are implemented to show a bit what can be done for a successful adaptation, and to, yeah, at some point maybe bridge this gap in finance. So that is where we really see the biggest potential for these case studies. Just very shortly, thank you.
Thank you, Ineke. And I would like to thank all the panelists for being with us, sharing your expertise. And I also would like to thank all the participants joining us. We will have a 15-minute break before the next part of our event. And I would like to ask Andrew to head straight to the stage for an audio and video check for the reporting back session. And everyone else, we will see you back at the main stage at past to hear the reports from the various workshops. Thank you very much.